Hey guys, just a quick thank you to all of you amazing legends that are subscribed. I could not have done it without you. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and it really helps our small team out. I went on this first date with a guy named Mike that I met on an app. He seemed pretty normal at first, one of those guys who had all the right things to say, made me laugh a little and didn't seem like a weirdo. He had this cool, laid-back vibe, and after chatting for a bit, we decided to meet up at a local restaurant that wasn't too fancy, but wasn't like a fast food joint either. Just your average sit-down spot. I remember feeling a little nervous because, let's be real, first dates are always a little weird, but we talked for a while and things started feeling a little more relaxed. We had some appetizers, joked about stupid things like why bread always seems to taste better in a restaurant than at home, and started getting into deeper stuff like travel and childhood memories. I wasn't feeling anything crazy, but I also wasn't feeling uncomfortable. He was charming in a way that made it easy to forget we were still technically strangers. After about an hour, I had just finished my wine and I noticed he seemed a little quieter. He kept fiddling with his phone, and at one point, he excused himself to go to the bathroom. At this point, I thought nothing of it. It wasn't like we were in some sketchy place, just a regular restaurant with decent lighting and waitstaff that knew what they were doing. But then, after about 10 minutes, I started to wonder what was going on. I figured, okay, maybe he got stuck in line or something. Then 15 minutes passed. At this point, I'm starting to feel the weird vibes. I glanced over at the door to the bathroom. No sign of him. I didn't want to freak out, but I did text him, asking if everything was all right. No response. It wasn't like he was just avoiding me either. He'd been answering my texts during dinner. I tried to play it cool, but I started scanning the room, wondering if he was just lingering somewhere else, or if he just dipped out without saying anything. I waited another 20 minutes. By this point, I was starting to feel like an idiot. I felt like I'd been stood up in a weird, passive-aggressive way. Like, I couldn't even give him the satisfaction of doing the usual, I'll text you when I'm home thing because he had just vanished. The waitstaff had started eyeing me because I was still sitting at the table like a complete weirdo. I asked one of the servers if she had seen him leave, and she said no, she hadn't. I'm not gonna lie, I was getting a little freaked out. I wasn't sure if something had happened to him. Maybe he had an emergency or something, but I started to feel stupid for staying. I mean, clearly I was just being left behind. I'd been coasted. I had no idea where Mike went, and the more I sat there, the more I realized he wasn't coming back. At this point, the check came. I could feel the pressure of the situation, the awkwardness of the whole thing just weighing on me. I considered just paying and leaving, but I wasn't sure how that would even work. I wasn't planning on paying for his part of the meal, but I also didn't want to look like I'd been totally stood up. So I asked the server if she'd seen Mike, and she said no, but she'd be happy to split the bill. At least I could get out of there without too much attention, right? When I paid for my meal and headed out, I thought about how ridiculous everything was. Here I was walking through the parking lot, trying to figure out where the hell Mike had gone. I even walked around the back of the restaurant to see if maybe he was just out in the parking lot talking to someone, but nope, nothing. No sign of him. As I was about to get into my car, I got a text from Mike. At first, I thought maybe he was going to explain himself or apologize or something, but it was completely different than what I expected. It wasn't some awkward excuse. It was just a random short message. The text said, "Sorry I had to go. Didn't think you'd notice. Hope you get home safe." That was it. That was his big explanation. No more, no less. I sat there in my car for a solid 5 minutes, just staring at the screen. My brain was trying to make sense of it. I wasn't even mad at first. I was just confused. Was this some kind of joke? Like some weird social experiment? Maybe he was just some kind of coaster who thought it was funny to leave people hanging. But as I thought about it more, the weirdness started to sink in. He hadn't even come up with a decent excuse. He hadn't paid for his part of the meal. Hell, he just straight up disappeared like it was no big deal. And the fact that he texted me after leaving made everything feel even creepier. It was like he didn't want me to know he was gone, but still felt the need to send some weird half-assed message. I blocked his number that night, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt off. Something didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just that he ditched me. It was that he did it so casually, like it wasn't even a big deal. And the weirdest part, after that night, I realized I couldn't even remember exactly what he looked like. I'd spent most of the evening talking to him, laughing, and being all chill, but now trying to picture his face, it was like the details were fading. I didn't want to overthink it, but the fact that I couldn't even picture his face made me feel like maybe I didn't know him as well as I thought I did. Maybe that's why it felt so easy for him to just leave, because he never really was there. I didn't tell anyone about the date at first. I didn't want to sound dramatic, but honestly, I didn't even know how to explain it. The whole thing felt surreal, and after blocking him, I figured I'd never hear from him again. But that wasn't the case. A couple of months later, I got a random message from a new number. I didn't recognize it, but I opened it anyway, thinking maybe it was some mistake. It was a simple text. I didn't want you to find out like this. It's better you don't know. Mike. I didn't respond. What could I even say? How do you respond to someone who disappeared off the face of the earth in a way that makes you feel like you're the one losing your mind? I thought my first date with Anne was going to be a typical let's grab some dinner, maybe catch a movie, see where it goes kind of thing. I've been talking to her for a couple of weeks. She was funny, down to earth, seemed like a solid person. So when we finally decided to meet up, I figured it'd be a good time. But I had no idea how completely off the rails this was about to go. We chose a cozy little Italian spot in the city, not too fancy, but nice enough to give the date a casual vibe. I got there a little early, which was probably a good thing because I could settle in and not feel like a total wreck. But as I'm waiting, Anne texted me that she was running late, something about a headache and some medication issues. I didn't think much of it at the time. I mean, who hasn't had those kinds of days, right? She said she was almost there, so I just sat back, scrolled through my phone, and tried to act cool. When she walked in, I actually had to do a double take. Anne was cute, like really cute. She had this warm, genuine smile that immediately put me at ease. But there was something a little off about the way she was walking. She didn't seem like she was in pain, but there was this slight hesitation in her steps, like she was trying to control something. Maybe she was just still dealing with her headache, I thought. I didn't want to overthink it. We got settled at our table, and for the first 20 minutes, things were going pretty smoothly. We talked about our favorite foods, random things we'd been watching on Netflix, the usual light stuff. Then she excused herself to go to the bathroom. No big deal, right? Happens all the time on dates. But after a while, she still wasn't back, and I started to get that weird feeling in my gut, like maybe something was wrong. Another 10 minutes passed. At this point, I was debating whether I should go check on her. Just as I was about to stand up, she walked back in, looking a little flustered but not necessarily upset. She sat down quickly, looked at me for a second, and then went straight to the menu without saying anything. I didn't think much of it, figuring she was just still not feeling great. We both started ordering, and I tried to ignore the awkward silence hanging in the air. As the night went on, things started to get strange. Anne was kind of jittery, looking around, tapping her foot. Every time she took a sip of her water, she would make this weird face, like she was trying not to gag. At first, I thought she was just nervous, which is totally normal on a first date, but then she started acting even weirder. She looked at me like she was about to say something, but then just went silent. I could tell something was off. Then came the bombshell. Anne suddenly clutched her stomach, her face turning pale. She leaned forward, clearly trying to hold it together, but it was obvious she wasn't doing well. I asked if she needed to go to the hospital or if she wanted to leave, but she just waved me off like it was no big deal. Just a stomach thing, she said. But she didn't look like someone who was just dealing with a random stomach ache. She was sweating, squirming in her seat, and her legs kept twitching like she couldn't stay still. At this point, I started getting seriously worried. She excused herself again, but this time she didn't look like she was going to the bathroom. She looked like she was about to sprint. I watched her go, thinking maybe I should just pay the bill and leave, but I didn't want to be a jerk. I mean, I had to be adult in the situation, right? A couple of minutes passed. Then Anne came back. But it wasn't like before. She was pale, shaky, and here's the part that still haunts me. Her pants were visibly soaked. It wasn't just a little accident either. She had clearly lost control. She stood there for a second, looking like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Instead, she just mumbled something about her medication and sat back down, trying her best to hide the mess. At that moment, I could feel the blood drain from my face. I didn't know what to say or do. I mean, what do you even do in a situation like that? I just sat there, frozen. Anne looked like she was about to cry, but she was too embarrassed to even make eye contact. She quickly grabbed her purse, stood up again, and said she needed to leave. There was no way I could stop her, especially since I didn't know how to handle this situation. She looked like she was going to run out of the restaurant, but before she did, she apologized over and over. I don't think she even realized how insane it was for her to try and apologize for something that was clearly out of her control. She was in full-on panic mode. Here's the kicker. As she was walking out, she said, "I took the wrong pills. I thought they were my painkillers." And it hit me like a ton of bricks. She had taken a laxative by mistake. She'd been telling me about her chronic pain earlier, but I didn't know she was dealing with that much stuff. She hadn't realized it was a laxative bottle in her purse. She grabbed the wrong one in her rush. I sat there in total shock, trying to process everything that just happened. It wasn't the day I had expected. It was like everything had spiraled into complete chaos. I wasn't mad at her. I just felt bad. She wasn't trying to embarrass herself. She wasn't trying to make me uncomfortable. She just screwed up. I didn't even get to pay the bill. The waiter came over, asked me if everything was okay, and I just handed him my card without saying much. I left the restaurant soon after and was kind of in a daze. I didn't know if I should reach out to Anne, if I should give her space, or if I should never talk to her again. But I figured she needed time to deal with whatever was going on with her, and maybe in the future we could laugh about it. But after that, I never heard from her again. And honestly, I don't know if I would have been ready to handle another date after that. It's one of those situations where you can't blame someone for an accident, but it still feels off. Like the universe just pulled one of those cosmic pranks on both of us. I'm just gonna get straight to it because this one still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. My first date with Kiki was supposed to be a chill, easy thing. We'd been texting for a while, and she seemed cool. We'd both liked the same movies, loved trying out new coffee spots, and had this easy flow to our conversations. So when we finally decided to meet up in person, I thought this is gonna be fun. And it started that way. We went to this cozy little burger joint near my place. Nothing fancy, just a place with good food and decent vibes. It was a Friday night, so the restaurant was buzzing with people, but we managed to get a table by the window, which made for some pretty good people watching. The conversation was going great. We laughed, talked about some random things, and honestly, I could have seen myself hanging out with her again. But of course, things don't always go the way you expect. After we ate, I offered to drive her home. She said it wasn't far and that she could walk, but I was already feeling the whole "let's make sure you get home safely" vibe. So I convinced her to let me give her a ride. We were walking to my car, chatting about some new music we had both heard recently when it happened. I was a few steps ahead of her when I heard this weird squishing sound. I turned around and there she was, Kiki, standing on the sidewalk, frozen with a horrified look on her face. She had stepped in something. And not just any something. Dog poop. Now, I don't know about you, but I absolutely cannot stand stepping in dog poop. It's one of those things that can ruin your entire day in the blink of an eye. And I could tell by the look on her face that she knew exactly what had happened. But instead of trying to wipe it off or freaking out, she started slowly walking toward my car, dragging her foot along the pavement like she was trying to clean it off. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to be the guy who made her feel worse, so I just kind of stood there, awkwardly waiting for her to catch up. She reached my car, and that's when things went downhill. I opened the passenger door for her, but instead of just getting in like a normal person, Kiki started wiping her shoe on the floor mat inside my car. I swear to God I couldn't make this up if I tried. She was just rubbing the poop-smeared shoe on my car mat like it was no big deal. In that moment, I honestly didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or get out of the car and pretend I never met her. But I stood there, absolutely frozen. She didn't even apologize or seem to realize how gross this whole thing was. She was just kind of wiping it off, all casual, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't get the words out. Part of me wanted to stop her and say, hey, maybe don't do that. But the other part of me, the part that didn't want to completely ruin the vibe of a first date, just stayed quiet. She finally got in the car, acting like nothing weird had happened, but I was sitting there with this intense wave of secondhand embarrassment. I started driving, trying to ignore the weird, awkward silence hanging between us. I don't even remember the drive to her place. I kept glancing over at the passenger seat, where I could still see traces of dog poop on the mat. It was like I was in some sort of fever dream. I had never thought I'd be in this situation. When we got to her place, she thanked me for the ride and said goodnight, completely oblivious to the fact that I was already mentally planning to burn my car mats. I tried to smile and act like everything was cool, but my brain was working overtime, just trying to process the last 30 minutes. What had I just witnessed? Was this some kind of bizarre test to see how much I could tolerate on a first date? As she got out of the car, I heard the sound of her phone buzzing. She reached into her pocket, pulled it out, and looked at the screen. I couldn't help but overhear her say something like, "Oh crap, I think I missed my laundry pickup." And for a split second, I thought maybe this was a sign. Maybe she just had bad luck, and this whole dog poop thing was some weird random incident that she wouldn't even remember by morning. But nope, it only got worse. As she closed the door, I watched her walk up to her apartment building, and that's when it hit me. I was still sitting there in the car, staring at damage. The poop stains on my mats, the lingering smell. The whole experience was a disaster, and I still couldn't believe how casually she handled it. I'm not a germaphobe or anything, but the fact that she just didn't seem to care, it got under my skin. After a few minutes of sitting there in silence, I finally just started driving home. I wanted to forget the whole thing. I mean, it was one night, right? It wasn't like I'd seen a future with Kiki anyway. Sure, we had some good conversation, but this was next level bad. There was no way I was going to try and make plans with her again after the whole dog poop incident. When I got home, I immediately grabbed a disinfectant wipe and started scrubbing the mats in my car. I probably spent 30 minutes cleaning that stuff off, but it still felt like it wasn't enough. I don't think I've ever been so grossed out by a single moment in my life. I kept thinking, why would she think it's okay to wipe dog poop on someone's car mats? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I probably should have just asked her to get out of the car when it happened. I ended up texting her later that night, telling her I had a good time, but that I wasn't feeling the connection. She didn't respond, and honestly, I was relieved. Looking back, it wasn't even the dog poop that ruined the date. It was the lack of awareness on her part. The fact that she didn't think twice about wiping her shoes on my mats just made everything feel off. I don't know what it says about a person when they don't even notice something like that, but I knew for sure I wasn't going to find out on date number 2. So, I'll just say it, my first date with Edward was wild, and not in a good way. It started off pretty normal, but by the end of it, I felt like I've been caught in a movie where everything goes wrong in the worst way possible. And trust me, I wasn't ready for any of it. I met Edward at the library. We were both reaching for the same book, and like a classic meet cute, we ended up talking about it. He seemed all right at first, smart, into the same kind of stuff I was reading, not too intense, which I liked. I wouldn't say there was this instant spark, but the conversation flowed. We exchanged numbers, and after a few days of texting, we agreed to meet up for dinner at this quiet restaurant. I figured it would be low pressure, easy, no big deal. How wrong I was. I got to the restaurant a little early, which I always do because I like to get settled before the awkwardness hits. The place was kind of upscale, dim lighting, white tablecloths, a fancy wine list, but not super over the top. Edward showed up about 10 minutes later. He looked good, tall, dressed well, that. He gave me a small smile when he walked in, but it didn't feel warm. It felt kind of reserved. I figured maybe he was just shy or tired, but whatever, it didn't seem like a huge deal. We sat down, and the first thing I noticed was how he acted when the waiter came to greet us. The guy was probably in his early 20s, just doing his job, looking a little nervous but friendly enough. Edward, however, immediately started throwing out a lot of attitude. At first, I thought he was joking, but the more I watched, the more I realized he wasn't. He kept snapping at the waiter about little things, like how long it took him to bring water, how the lighting was too dim at our table, how the menu was too complicated. I kept trying to play it off, making small talk with the waiter just to ease the tension, but Edward wasn't having it. When the waiter left, I tried to change the subject, asking Edward how his day had been. He kept making these little grumbling noises and muttering under his breath about how the place wasn't professional enough. Honestly, I started to feel a little uncomfortable. I mean, I get being picky about things, but this guy was ripping into the waiter for nothing. I didn't know if I should bring it up or just let it go, so I stayed quiet. The waiter came back with the drinks, and as he placed the glasses on the table, he accidentally knocked one over. It wasn't a big deal, just a small spill, but Edward completely lost it. He immediately stood up, slammed his hand on the table, and started yelling at the waiter. I was seriously in shock. I didn't know what was happening. The waiter apologized over and over, but Edward wasn't listening. He kept calling him clumsy and saying things like, "Are you stupid or just incompetent?" The waiter looked like he was about to cry. I felt my face getting hot with embarrassed for the guy, and for myself, honestly. The entire restaurant had started turning their heads. I didn't know what to do. I tried to ask Edward if he was okay, but he just brushed me off, still ranting about how the waiter was ruining his night. At that point, I felt like I had to intervene. I told Edward that it wasn't a big deal and that he should just calm down. He shot me this look like I was the problem. I don't know if he was embarrassed or just angry, but Edward finally sat back down, muttering under his breath. The waiter was standing there holding a napkin, looking like he was ready to run away. I wanted to tell him it was okay, but before I could, Edward waved him off like he was some kind of pest, telling him to go fix his mistake. It was so uncomfortable. I didn't know if I should leave or if I should just stick it out and finish the meal. I didn't even want to eat at this point, but I didn't want to be rude. Then things got even worse. Edward picked up the menu like he was trying to change the subject, but he kept sighing loudly. The waiter came back with the check after a while, trying to avoid any more issues, but as he handed it to Edward, he apparently made some small mistake with the itemized list. And that was it. Edward snapped. Without warning, he stood up again and, I kid you not, punched the waiter. Not in the face, but in the chest, hard enough that the poor guy stumbled backward. I was in complete shock. I couldn't process what was happening. The waiter just stood there looking like he didn't know whether to run or cry. Edward was still yelling, something about not getting good service and needing to be treated properly. I stood there, frozen, not knowing if I should leave, if I should call the police, or if I should just crawl under the table and disappear. Before I could do anything, the restaurant manager rushed over and called for security. The waiter was crying by this point, and people around us were murmuring. The manager went straight for Edward and told him he needed to leave. Of course, Edward wasn't having it. He started shouting at the manager too, saying how he was disrespected and demanded better treatment. That's when the police showed up. A couple of officers came in, and the situation went from uncomfortable to downright terrifying. They asked Edward to step outside, and when he refused, they told him they'd have to arrest him. He started arguing with them too, as if this was some sort of injustice happening to him. I could barely stand there, watching it all unfold. At this point, I didn't even know if I should apologize to the waiter or just slip out of the restaurant quietly. The officers cuffed Edward, and he kept yelling all the way to the door. The manager came over to me and said they'd take care of everything, but I didn't know what to do next. My stomach was in knots. I just paid for my drink and walked out, barely able to process the madness of the night. I texted a friend afterward, just saying, "Date from hell. Never again." I didn't get any closure with Edward. I didn't even know what had gone through his mind to act that way. It was one of those things where you think, why did I even think this was a good idea? I'm still not sure what happened that night, but I'm glad it's over. The whole thing was a weird mix of rage, embarrassment, and confusion. I guess you could say I learned a pretty harsh lesson about not ignoring red flags, but honestly, I didn't need that kind of reminder. I'll definitely be more careful about who I meet from now on. So this date with Emily, it was one of those that you think is going to be the start of something awesome, and then it completely unravels and you're left thinking, what the hell just happened? I met Emily on Tinder. We matched and started chatting. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual small talk. She was cute, had a nice smile, and seemed pretty cool in her profile pics. She said she was a lawyer and a model, which I admit sounded a little too perfect to be true, but she had all these professional looking photos, and she seemed confident, so I didn't question it. I figured maybe she was just one of those people who had a really put together life. We exchanged a few messages, and after a couple of days of chatting, she suggested we meet for drinks at this trendy bar downtown. I was excited. A cute lawyer who's also a model. What are the chances, right? I kept thinking that I had somehow hit the jackpot. I've had a few not so great dates before, but this one felt different. She was smart, funny, and seemed really into me. So when the day of the date arrived, I was feeling pretty optimistic. I got to the bar a little early, grabbed a table in the back, and waited for her to show up. I'll admit I was nervous, but it wasn't that this is going to go horribly nervousness. It was more of the excited kind. A couple of drinks in, I started thinking about how cool it would be to tell my friends about this date with the lawyer/model, who seemed like she had her whole life together. But when Emily walked in, my excitement immediately took a nosedive. She looked different, like Not a huge difference, but enough to make me pause for a second. Her profile pictures, not even close. The hair was the same, and her face was familiar to everything else. Nah, she was shorter than I expected, which was fine, but her outfit looked kind of thrown together, like she didn't even try. Her jeans were a little too baggy, and the top she wore was just this plain t shirt, not the model vibes I've been picturing. But whatever, maybe she was just going for a more casual look. I couldn't expect her to walk in wearing heels and a fancy dress every time, right? We greeted each other with a hug, and she sat down. Honestly, she seemed a little awkward at first, but I figured she was just shy. I didn't mind it. I was a little nervous too. We ordered drinks, and the conversation started pretty normal. But as we got talking more, I began to notice things weren't adding up. At first, she was talking about how hard it was being a lawyer, how much time she spent in court, dealing with clients, doing paperwork, all the usual lawyer stuff. But when I asked her where she worked, she gave me a weird answer. Something about being in between firms at the moment, kind of freelancing until a big case came through. I didn't think much of it at first, but something in the back of my mind started buzzing. I mean, sure, I guess being a lawyer could involve some downtime, but it sounded a little too vague. Then we moved on to talk about her modeling career. She had tons of photos on her profile, some where she looked like she was on photo shoots, dressed up in fancy clothes, and others where she was traveling. So when I asked her what agency she worked with, she got this uncomfortable look on her face, then sort of stammered about how she had done a few freelance gigs here and there, and that she hadn't really been booked lately. I started to get the vibe that she was, at best, exaggerating. I tried not to let it show that I was picking up on these inconsistencies, but by the time we finished our first round of drinks, I was starting to feel off. I mean, she had talked up this amazing life, and yet didn't seem to have any real details to back it up. I asked her what kind of law she specialized in. She went on about corporate stuff, but didn't seem to know how to explain it in any real depth. She said something about contracts and deals, but her answers kept getting vaguer the more I pressed. It was like she was just throwing out words to keep up the illusion. By now, I wasn't even listening that closely to what she was saying. I was too busy trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Then, out of nowhere, she said she was between jobs at the moment, not really practicing law or doing much of anything. I almost choked on my drink. Wait, what? She said she was a lawyer, but now she was telling me she didn't even have a job. I tried not to let it show on my face that I was a little shocked. She quickly pivoted to talking about how much she liked freelance work because it gave her the flexibility to travel and work on her modeling career. Yeah, right. But it didn't end there. I decided to call her bluff. I didn't want to accuse her of anything, but I asked her if she had any upcoming photo shoots or if she was involved with any agencies. Her eyes darted around the room for a second, and she laughed awkwardly before telling me she was taking a break from modeling right now to focus on personal stuff. At that point, I started feeling like I was in some sort of weird game where I was the last one to realize I was being played. I didn't know what to do. I just kind of stared at her for a few seconds, trying to figure out if she was going to fess up or keep up the act. I started to wonder if she'd even ever been a lawyer or a model, or if it was all just some fabricated persona. Something about the way she was telling the stories made it seem so rehearsed, like she had practiced it. The rest of the date was kind of a blur. I could barely focus on what she was saying because I was so busy processing everything. The conversation felt shallow, and every time I tried to steer it to something real, she'd change the subject or give some vague answer. Eventually, I just stopped asking questions. When the check came, I didn't even wait to split it. I just paid for the drinks and walked out, my head spinning. I couldn't believe it. I just spent 2 hours with a person who had completely lied about who they were. I guess I knew deep down that people do this sort of thing all the time on dating apps. But it's one thing to hear about it from other people and another to live out. I got into my car, drove home, and deleted her from my contacts, blocking her on every app. I couldn't get her out of my head, but I knew there was no way I was ever going to see her again. I had learned the hard way that not everything or everyone is what it seems online. Okay, so this first date with Daniel. It was seriously weird, like disturbing weird. I don't even know how to explain it properly without sounding like I'm making it up, but trust me, I'm not. It was the kind of thing that makes you question how well you really know someone, even if you've only known them for a few hours. So, I met Daniel through this mutual friend of mine. We were chatting online for a while, and after a couple of weeks, we decided to meet up for coffee. He seemed nice enough in our texts, laid back, funny, easygoing. He told me he was into sports, working as a personal trainer, and had just moved back to the area after some time living abroad. Honestly, everything about him seemed pretty normal, or at least it did at the time. When we met in person, I was a little surprised because he looked way different than in his photos. He was taller than I expected, but his energy was off. He was kind of jittery, like he was on edge or something. I figured maybe he was just nervous, though. I mean, first dates are weird for everyone. Anyway, we had coffee, talked for a bit, and it was honestly pretty chill. No huge red flags. He told me about his time overseas and how he was trying to get his life together after a messy breakup. I felt bad for him, and he seemed like he was really trying to turn things around. So after a while, we ended up walking around the park nearby, just chatting. Everything seemed fine. Here's where it gets strange. Around 9 p.m., we were walking back to the parking lot when he suddenly turned to me and asked if I wanted to come over to his place. I didn't think much of it at first, like maybe he was just offering to hang out, maybe watch a movie or something. But then he kept pushing, saying it would be fun to chill out and hang with him and his boys. I wasn't sure what that meant, but whatever. I figured he just wanted to invite me over to his apartment. But then, as we got to his car, he really started pushing the idea. He started talking about how he needed me to come over, because if I did, he'd get to tell his friends he had a date and that it would look cool to them. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just a weird way of trying to impress me. But when I said no, that I didn't feel like hanging out with a bunch of guys I didn't know, his whole demeanor shifted. He got really quiet, like eerily quiet. And then this is where it gets really uncomfortable. He asked me if I'd be willing to sleep over at his mom's house. Yeah, you heard that right. His mom's house. Now, I know some people live with their parents at different points in their lives, and that's fine. But the way Daniel asked me was so strange. He said he really needed to prove something to the boys, and he couldn't do it unless I came back with him. He promised it wouldn't be weird, that we could just hang out in his room and talk, but he begged me to stay over so he could tell the guys he was finally making progress. I didn't know what to say. I was pretty taken aback. I tried to laugh it off, like, haha, no thanks. But he just stared at me like he was waiting for me to change my mind. It honestly felt like he wasn't even asking if I wanted to. He was just expecting me to agree so he could impress his friends or whatever. But when I said no and I said I wasn't comfortable with it, he completely lost it. I didn't think he'd react the way he did. At first, it seemed like he was going to just drop it and be cool, but instead, he got really upset, like on the verge of tears. It was honestly one of the weirdest things I'd ever seen. His face twisted like he was hurt by my response, and he started saying that I didn't understand how important this was to him. He told me that if I didn't come with him, it would ruin everything. I had no idea what he meant by that, but he wasn't giving up. He was crying, saying things like, "Please just come with me. I need this so bad. You'll understand." He wasn't being aggressive or anything, but it was so intense that I didn't know what to do. It felt like he was pressuring me, but in this weird, emotional way that made me feel like I was somehow responsible for his happiness. At this point, I started feeling super uncomfortable, but I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to back off a little more. I told him again that I wasn't ready for that kind of thing, and that I just wasn't comfortable with the situation. But instead of respecting that, he started crying harder. Full-on, dramatic tears like he couldn't believe I was turning him down. It was honestly a little scary. It was so over the top that I started to feel trapped, like if I didn't say yes, I'd be doing something terrible to him. I wanted to get out of there, but I didn't want to be mean or make a scene. So I kept trying to reassure him that it wasn't personal, that I just wasn't ready to do something like that. Eventually, he calmed down enough to where I felt like I could leave without him completely losing it, so I just said I was going home. It wasn't an angry goodbye or anything, but I felt so shaken by the whole thing. On the drive home, I just couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It was like I'd gone from thinking I was on a chill first date to suddenly being in this weird, manipulative situation where this guy was trying to drag me into his drama. I mean, I get being nervous about dating, but begging someone to come over to your mom's house to prove something to your friends, that's not normal. I ended up blocking his number that night. I figured he'd probably text or call later, but honestly, I didn't care to deal with it. It was about being too nice or anything. It was about him being incredibly needy in a way that didn't feel healthy at all. I didn't want to be his emotional crutch, especially on a first date. In hindsight, I don't even know how to classify what happened. It wasn't just a bad date. It felt manipulative. He tried to emotionally guilt me into doing something I wasn't comfortable with, and I wasn't about to play into that. Now, whenever I think back on it, I can't help but feel weirded out by how everything unfolded. I'm just glad I stuck to my gut and didn't go along with it, but still, never again. So I matched with this guy, Connor, on Hinge. His profile was, well, it was something. He had these pictures of him in what looked like expensive suits, standing in front of fancy cars, and his bio said he was a big time businessman. I mean, I wasn't looking for a sugar daddy or anything, but hey, a girl can appreciate a guy who's got his life together, right? We chatted for a bit, and he seemed nice enough, charming even. He asked me out to this steakhouse downtown, one of those places where the menu doesn't have prices because if you have to ask, you can't afford it. I was impressed. Maybe a little too impressed. The night started off. Okay. I showed up at the restaurant, and he was already there, waiting at the table. He looked different. Not bad, just different. His suit wasn't as sharp as it looked in the pictures, and his hair was a little messy, like he'd just rolled out of bed. But whatever, I thought. Maybe he had a long day. We sat down, and he started talking about his business ventures. It was all very vague. Something about import, export, and high stakes deals. I nodded along, trying to seem interested, but honestly, I was more focused on the menu. I'd never been to a place like this before, and I was excited to try something fancy. Then the waiter came over, and Connor ordered for both of us. He got the most expensive steak on the menu, some fancy wine, and a bunch of sides. I figured he was just trying to impress me, so I didn't think much of it. We ate, and the food was amazing. Like, seriously, the best steak I ever had. But as the meal went on, I started to notice little things. Like how he kept glancing at his phone, or how he'd suddenly change the subject whenever I asked him something specific about his job. It was weird, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just nervous. Then the bill came. The waiter placed it on the table, and Connor didn't even look at it. He just sat there, smiling at me like everything was fine. I waited for him to pull out his wallet, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned in and said, "So odd, I kind of forgot my wallet at home. Do you think you could cover this? I'll pay you back, I promise." I was stunned. Like, seriously, what the hell? I mean, I'm not broke or anything, but this place was expensive. Like, asterisk, really asterisk expensive. And he ordered all that food, all that wine. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there staring at him, trying to figure out if he was joking. But he wasn't. He just kept smiling like this was totally normal. I didn't want to make a scene, so I ended up paying. But I was pissed. Like, seriously pissed. I mean, who does that? Who takes someone to a fancy restaurant and then expects asterisk them asterisk to pay? I wanted to leave right then and there, but he insisted on walking me to my car. I didn't want to argue, so I let him. Big mistake. We got outside, and it was dark, like really dark. The restaurant was in this kind of sketchy part of town, and the streetlights were all flickering. I was already on edge, and then Connor started acting weird. He kept looking over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to jump out of us. And he was walking really close to me, way too close. I tried to speed up, but he just matched my pace. Then he started talking, and it wasn't about his job or anything normal. No, he started talking about how he knew things about me. Like personal things, things I hadn't told him. He mentioned my favorite coffee shop, the park I like to run in, even the name of my cat. I was freaking out. How did he know all that? I hadn't posted any of that stuff online. I hadn't even told him my last name. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I just wanted to get to my car and get out of there. But then he grabbed my arm. Not hard, but enough to make me stop. He leaned in close, and his breath smelled like wine and something else, something metallic. He whispered, "You're not going anywhere." I don't know how I did it, but I managed to pull away. I started running, but he was right behind me. I could hear his footsteps, his breathing. I didn't look back. I just ran. My car was parked a few blocks away, and it felt like it took forever to get there. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I just drove. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away. My mind was racing. How did he know all that stuff about me? Why was he following me? What the hell was going on? I ended up driving to a gas station a few miles away. I parked under a bright light and just sat there trying to catch my breath. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What would I even say? Hey, my date lied about being rich and then acted super creepy. It sounded ridiculous, but I was scared, really scared. I stayed there for what felt like hours, just sitting in my car, watching the door of the gas station. Every time someone walked in or out, my heart would jump. I kept expecting to see Connor, but he never showed up. Eventually, I calmed down enough to drive home. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about what had happened, about all the little things that had seemed off. The way he looked at me and the way he talked, it was like he'd been planning this, like he'd been watching me. The next morning, I got a text from him. It just said, "Thanks for dinner." I blocked his number immediately, but it didn't make me feel any better. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there watching me waiting. I didn't go on any more dates after that. I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, I remember the way he grabbed my arm, the way he whispered in my ear. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. A few weeks later, I saw his picture on the news. He'd been arrested for stalking and harassment. Turns out he'd done this before. He'd lied to other women, taken them out, and then, well, I don't even want to think about what he'd done to them. I was lucky. I got away. All right, so let me tell you about the most awkward, cringeworthy, and downright bizarre first date I've ever been on. It started like any other modern day romance, swiping right on a dating app. Her name was Anna. Her profile was normal, I guess. Few pictures, a bio that said she loved hiking, coffee, and dogs. You know, the usual stuff. We chatted for a few days and she seemed cool. Funny, even. So when she suggested meeting up at Starbucks, I thought, asterisk, why not? Asterisk at Starbucks. Neutral ground. Safe, casual. What could go wrong? Everything. I got there early because, I didn't want to be asterisk that guy asterisk who shows up late and makes a bad first impression. I ordered my usual, a caramel macchiato because I'm basic like that, and found the table near the window. I was scrolling through my phone, trying to look chill when I saw her walk in. She looked different from her pictures. Not in a bad way, just different. Her hair was a little messier, and she was wearing this oversized sweater that practically swallowed her whole. But hey, no judgment. Maybe she was going for the effortlessly cool vibe. She spotted me almost immediately and waved. I waved back, trying to play it cool, but inside I was already panicking. First dates are always nerve-wracking, right? But then she did something I was asterisk, not asterisk prepared for. Instead of sitting in the chair across from me like a normal person, she walked right up to me, smiled, and plopped herself down on my lap. Yeah, my lap. I froze. My brain short-circuited. I didn't know what to do. Do I push her off? Do I say something? Do I just sit there and pretend this is totally fine? I opted for the last one because, honestly, I was too stunned to do anything else. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the Starbucks on us. The barista behind the counter, the old guy reading a newspaper, the group of teenagers in the corner, they were all staring. I wanted to disappear. Anna, meanwhile, seemed completely unfazed. She just sat there, chatting away like this was the most normal thing in the world. She asked me how my day was, if I came here often, if I liked her sweater. I answered in monosyllables, my face burning hotter than the coffee in my cup. I couldn't even look her in the eye. I just stared at the table, praying for the ground to open up and swallow me whole. After what felt like an eternity, she finally got up. I thought the nightmare was over, but no, she grabbed my hand and pulled me to my feet. "Let's go for a walk," she said, like it was a suggestion and not a command. I didn't argue. I just followed her out of the Starbucks, my brain still trying to process what had just happened. We walked down the street, and she kept holding my hand, like really holding it. Not the casual, we're just walking kind of hand holding, but the we're in a rom-com, and this is our meet cute kind of hand holding. It was a lot. I didn't know what to do, so I just went with it. Maybe this was normal for her. Maybe I was the weird one for thinking it was weird. We ended up at a park nearby. It was one of those small neighborhood parks with a playground and a few benches. She dragged me over to the swings and sat down, patting the one next to her. I sat down, still feeling like I was in some kind of surreal dream. She started swinging, kicking her legs up and laughing like a little kid. I just sat there, clutching the chains of my swing, wondering how my life had come to this. Then she started asking me questions. Really personal questions. Like, what's your biggest fear? And have you ever been in love? And do you believe in soulmates? I answered as best I could, but every word felt like it was being pulled out of me with pliers. She, on the other hand, was an open book. She told me about her ex-boyfriends, her childhood, her dreams of traveling the world. It was overwhelming. I didn't know how to keep up. At one point, she stopped swinging and turned to look at me. "You're really quiet," she said, tilting her head to the side. "Are you always like this?" I didn't know what to say. I mean, yeah, I'm usually pretty quiet, but this was next level awkward. I just shrugged and looked away, hoping she'd drop it. She didn't. Instead, she stood up and walked over to me, standing so close I could smell her perfume. It was sweet like vanilla or something, but it was making me feel nauseous. She reached out and touched my face, her fingers brushing against my cheek. I flinched, but she didn't seem to notice. "You're cute," she said, smiling. "I like you." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there, frozen, as she leaned in closer. For a second, I thought she was going to kiss me, and I panicked. I stood up so fast I almost knocked her over. "I have to go," I stammered, backing away. "I just remember I have something. I have to do something." She looked disappointed, but she didn't try to stop me. "Okay," she said, still smiling. "Text me later." I nodded, even though I had no intention of ever texting her again, and practically ran out of the park. I didn't stop running until I got home. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my heart racing. What the hell had just happened? Who was that girl? And why did she think it was okay to sit on my lap in the middle of a Starbucks? I spent the rest of the night replaying the date in my head, trying to figure out where it had gone wrong. Was it something I said? Something I did? Or was she just like that? I didn't know. All I knew was that I never wanted to see her again. The next day, I got a text from her. "Had fun yesterday. When are we hanging out again?" I stared at my phone, my stomach churning. I didn't reply. I just blocked her number and deleted the app. Maybe online dating wasn't for me, or maybe I just had really bad luck. Either way, I was sticking to coffee dates with friends from now on. At least they know better than to sit on my lap. Instead, she stood up and walked over to me, standing so close I could smell her perfume. It was sweet like vanilla or something, but it was making me feel nauseous. She reached out and touched my face, her fingers brushing against my cheek. I flinched, but she didn't seem to notice. "You're cute," she said, smiling. "I like you." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there, frozen, as she leaned in closer. For a second, I thought she was going to kiss me, and I panicked. I stood up so fast I almost knocked her over. "I have to go," I stammered, backing away. "I just remember I have something. I have to do something." She looked disappointed, but she didn't try to stop me. "Okay," she said, still smiling. "Text me later." I nodded, even though I had no intention of ever texting her again, and practically ran out of the park. I didn't stop running until I got home. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my heart racing. What the hell had just happened? Who was that girl? And why did she think it was okay to sit on my lap in the middle of a Starbucks? I spent the rest of the night replaying the date in my head, trying to figure out where it had gone wrong. Was it something I said? Something I did? Or was she just like that? I didn't know. All I knew was that I never wanted to see her again. The next day, I got a text from her. "Had fun yesterday. When are we hanging out again?" I stared at my phone, my stomach churning. I didn't reply. I just blocked her number and deleted the app. Maybe online dating wasn't for me, or maybe I just had really bad luck. Either way, I was sticking to coffee dates with friends from now on. At least they know better than to sit on my lap. Alright, so let me tell you about the weirdest, most uncomfortable first date I've ever been on. It all started when I matched with this guy named Evan on a dating app. His profile seemed normal, I guess. He had a picture of himself hiking, another one with a dog, and his bio said he was into nature, books, and trying new things. Sounded harmless enough. We chatted for a few days, and he seemed nice. A little awkward, maybe, but nice. So when he asked me out for coffee, I thought, asterisk, why not, asterisk, it's just coffee. How bad could it be? We met at this little cafe downtown. It was one of those artsy places with mismatched furniture and chalkboard menus. I got there first and ordered a latte, trying to look casual as I waited for him to show up. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked different from his pictures. His hair was kind of messy, and he was wearing this weird outfit, like a plaid shirt tucked into khaki pants that were way too short. But whatever, I thought, maybe he's just quirky. He spotted me and waved, then walked over to my table. He didn't say hi or anything. He just sat down and stared at me for a second before blurting out, "I like your shoes." I looked down at my shoes, which were just plain white sneakers, and mumbled a thanks. Already, I could tell this was going to be interesting. The first few minutes were okay. We talked about the usual first date stuff, where we grew up, what we did for work, that kind of thing. But then, out of nowhere, he started talking about insects. Like, not just talking about them, but really talking about them. He went on this long rant about how underappreciated they were and how they were the future of food. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded along, hoping he'd change the subject. He didn't. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started showing me pictures of bugs. Not just any bugs, though. These were bugs he'd apparently eaten. There was a picture of him holding a fried tarantula, another one of him with a bowl of roasted crickets, and, I kid you not, a selfie of him with a live grasshopper in his mouth. I felt my stomach turn, but he didn't seem to notice. He just kept going, talking about how each one tasted and how he prepared them. At this point, I was seriously considering making a run for it, but before I could come up with an excuse to leave, he dropped the bomb. "You should try some," he said, looking at me with this weird, intense expression. "I have some with me if you want." I blinked at him, trying to process what he'd just said. "You have bugs with you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, grinning like this was the most normal thing in the world, and reached into his bag. He pulled out a small plastic container and set it on the table between us. Inside were what looked like dried mealworms, all shiny and brown, and wriggling, I swear, one of them moved. I felt my stomach lurch. No thanks," I said, pushing the container back toward him. "I'm good." He looked disappointed but didn't push it. Instead, he popped the lid off the container and started eating them himself, right there, in the middle of the cafe. I could hear the crunching sounds as he chewed, and I had to look away to keep from gagging. The worst part was, he kept talking the whole time like this was totally normal. "They're really high in protein," he said between bites. "And they're sustainable, like way better for the environment than beef or chicken." I didn't know what to say. I just sat there staring at my coffee, wishing I could teleport out of there. When it got worse, after he finished the mealworms, he started talking about how he wanted to start his own insect farm. He had this whole business plan worked out, complete with charts and graphs that he'd apparently drawn by hand. He pulled out a notebook and started flipping through it, showing me sketches of beetle larvae and cricket enclosures. I tried to look interested, but honestly, I was just trying not to throw up. By the time he finally stopped talking, my coffee was cold, and I was pretty sure I'd lost my appetite for the rest of the week. I glanced at the clock on my phone and realized we'd been there for over an hour of bugs. Bugs and awkward silences and that weird, intense look he kept giving me. I thought I was in for a pretty chill first date with Polly. I'd met her through some mutual friends, and we'd been chatting for a few days before we decided to meet up for dinner. She seemed fun, quirky, and had a nice sense of humor from our texts. But what happened that night? Yeah, that was not fun, quirky, or funny. It was straight up disturbing. Let me backtrack. So I'm sitting at this small Italian place downtown, the kind with checkered tablecloths and dim lighting, real cozy. I had been there before, and the food was good. We had agreed to meet at 7, and I showed up about 10 minutes early as usual. I'm a little nervous because, let's face it, first dates can be a gamble. You never really know how it's going to go, right? But she seemed nice enough online, so I figured this was going to be a casual, low-pressure dinner. Polly arrives right on time, and the first thing I notice is that she's wearing this bright red dress. It's bold, but she seems to pull it off. She's got this air of confidence about her, which is nice because, let's be honest, a lot of people are nervous on first dates, but she's owning it, walking over to the table like she's in a movie. I think, okay, she's definitely got some style. She sits down, and we start talking about the usual things. How work's been, what we've been up to, all that jazz. We order some appetizers and drinks, and everything seems fine. At least for the first 10 minutes or so. Then, out of nowhere, she starts talking about her dress. She says something like, "So, what do you think of my dress?" I figure this is a pretty standard question. Women wear nice clothes on dates, and they probably want a little validation. I mean, I've got no problem with that. But here's the thing, She didn't just want a compliment, she was kind of demanding one. At first, I didn't quite catch on to the vibe. I thought she was just fishing for a nice remark. So I said something like, "Yeah, it's a great color. Really suits you." I was trying to be polite without overdoing it because, honestly, I wasn't blown away by the dress. It was nice, but it didn't feel like the kind of outfit that deserved to be praised like it was a coat or gown. But I didn't want to upset her or make things awkward, so I gave a safe, neutral response. I expected her to move on, but instead, she just stared at me. It wasn't like a thank you or a smile, just this intense look like she was waiting for more. There was a long pause, and I started to feel uncomfortable. I mean, maybe I was reading too much into it, but it felt like she wanted me to go above and beyond with the compliments. I tried again. I said something like, "The dress really pops. I bet you get a lot of attention when you wear it." I thought that would be good enough. She'd get her praise, we'd move on, and everything would be fine. But instead of the smile I was hoping for, she gets this look in her eyes like she's almost offended by my response. I can't explain it, but it was as if I'd just insulted her whole existence. It was seriously unsettling. She leaned in a little closer and said, "Is that all? You don't think I look amazing?" Now I'm starting to feel the pressure. It's just a dress, right? But she's acting like it's the most important thing in the world right now. My brain starts to race trying to think of something more flattering to say, but honestly, I wasn't into the whole thing. I was kind of wondering what was going on with her. She barely mentioned anything about herself except for the dress. It felt like she was using it as some sort of test, and I was failing. She wasn't letting up. "I bet you didn't even notice how it fits my curves, Tuck," she says, with this tone like she's accusing me of something. My mind is spinning at this point. I really wasn't sure where she was coming from. I thought we were just supposed to eat, laugh, and maybe get to know each other a little more, not talk about dresses for 30 minutes. The waitress came over to drop off our entrees, and that's when everything hit the fan. Polly glanced at the plate of pasta in front of her, and for some reason that seemed to set her off even more. Her face twisted, and before I could even process what was happening, she grabbed her plate and threw it at me. Like, full on threw it. The plate hit my chest with a loud clatter, splattering sauce all over my shirt and pants. I just sat there in shock for a second, trying to comprehend what had just happened. People around us stared. I could hear the sounds of people whispering and the awkward silence of the restaurant. Polly, however, didn't seem to care about any of that. She was looking at me, this mixture of rage and something else, disappointment, maybe, on her face. She wasn't even apologizing or laughing it off. She was dead serious. She just sat back in her chair, folding her arms, waiting for me to react. I don't even know what to say. My heart was racing, and my mind was still processing the fact that I had a plate of pasta on my lap. The waitress immediately came over to check on me, looking apologetic. She offered to bring me a new shirt or clean my clothes, but honestly, I didn't care about any of that. I was just trying to figure out how the hell I got into this situation. And the worst part, Polly didn't even seem remorseful. She wasn't sorry for throwing food at me. She didn't apologize or act embarrassed. Instead, she just said, "You didn't compliment me enough. That's your problem." I couldn't believe it. I was sitting there covered in pasta, trying to figure out how to get out of there without making a scene. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized how out of touch she was. She wasn't even trying to make it right. It was like she thought I had done something wrong by not worshiping her dress or giving her the attention she thought she deserved. At that point, I knew this date was over. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and walked out. I didn't say anything else. I couldn't. It felt like I was in some weird nightmare. I left the restaurant, not caring about my ruined clothes or anything else. I just needed to get away from her. I don't know what was going through Polly's head. Maybe she had some insecurity she was hiding, or maybe she just wanted to see how far she could push me. But whatever it was, I wasn't sticking around to find out. It wasn't just the food or the fact that she threw it at me. It was the whole attitude. She was manipulative, and honestly, it was scary. After that, I never heard from her again. I don't think she cared to follow up. And honestly, I'm glad. Because that first date, it was a nightmare. It was one of those nights that I thought would just be a casual dinner, the kind you get when you're trying to get to know someone. But it turned out to be so much worse. I had matched with Walter on a dating app a few weeks earlier, and he seemed all right at first. He was funny, had a decent job, and even sent me these really cute selfies with his dog. Nothing was off. So when he asked me out for a nice dinner, I said yes without thinking much of it. We met at this little Italian place in the middle of downtown. You know the type. Romantic lighting. The whole cozy but not too intimate vibe. I was wearing a simple dress because I didn't want to come off too much, but also didn't want to seem like I didn't try. Walter was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table by the window, staring out like he was deep in thought. He looked exactly how he did in his pictures. Tall, scruffy in a way that felt intentional, and wearing a button-down shirt that made him look a little too polished for my liking. When I sat down, he smiled, and we got to talking. He was charming in the beginning, talking about his hobbies, making small jokes about how much he hated his job. Nothing strange, just typical small talk. But something in the air felt off. Not in a big way, just a little weird. As the night went on, the conversation started shifting. We talked about our lives, our families, and the usual stuff. Then, somehow, we got on the topic of politics. I should have known better. I really should have. I told him I was conservative, nothing too intense, just that I leaned right on most issues. I wasn't expecting him to flip out or anything, but his reaction was, well, weird. His face tightened, his smile faltered, and there was this awkward pause before he just kind of grunted and changed the subject. I didn't think too much of it, because we had barely scratched the surface of politics, but something told me he wasn't too thrilled about it. I brushed it off. We kept talking, the food came, and things seemed to be settling back into a normal rhythm. I was halfway through my pasta, talking about my love for animals, when out of nowhere, Walter just stopped eating. I noticed he was looking at me like he was trying to figure something out. And then, with no warning, he spat a full mouthful of pasta directly onto me. Not like a little bit of food on my lap. No, it was a full, disgusting splatter of sauce and noodles all over my chest. I froze. I honestly didn't know what to do. The waiter had just walked by, and he saw it, but it felt like everything slowed down. Walter's face was unreadable. No apology. No shock. Just this weird calmness like he didn't even realize what he'd just done. I was too stunned to say anything for a good 5 seconds, and then I asked, "What the hell?" But he didn't answer me. Instead, he started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, not even an awkward laugh. This full, maniacal laugh that didn't sound like it was coming from a normal person. He laughed for so long that I thought I was hallucinating. I sat there covered in pasta, feeling every part of my body tense up. Was this some kind of joke? It didn't feel like it. The weird part was he didn't seem sorry. He wasn't even embarrassed. He didn't try to clean it up, apologize, or ask if I was okay. Instead, he just kept laughing like he'd won some sick game. At this point, I was trying to process it all. My mind was racing. What was happening? Was this a test? Did I say something wrong? I mean, I had just mentioned my political views, but I never imagined anyone would react like this. But then Walter stopped laughing, looked me dead in the eyes, and said something that made my stomach turn. "You really thought it was normal, huh?" He said it like he was speaking to a child, but there was no warmth in his voice, just a cold, calculated tone. I felt a wave of confusion and embarrassment wash over me, but I couldn't even get the words out. I wanted to stand up, grab my purse, and leave, but my legs felt like they were stuck in cement. I just sat there, trying to understand what had just happened. Walter leaned back in his chair, and without even caring that I was sitting there covered in his spit and food, he casually asked me if I actually thought conservatives were human. His voice wasn't angry, it wasn't loud. It was almost clinical, like he was talking about a subject he had no connection to. That's when I realized. This wasn't just a strange reaction to a political disagreement. There was something deeply wrong with this guy. He didn't just dislike people with different views, he hated them. Hated them in a way that made me feel physically uncomfortable. I couldn't sit there any longer. My stomach turned, and I had this overwhelming sense of dread creep up on me. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and grabbed my purse. Walter didn't even react. He just watched me with that cold, distant stare. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice shaky, but he didn't even try to stop me. He just smiled like he'd won whatever twisted game he'd been playing. I don't even remember walking out of the restaurant. I was too busy trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wasn't angry at first. I was just confused. I'm still confused. How could someone be so angry over something so small, especially with someone they barely know? By the time I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something much worse. There was no huge fight, no big dramatic scene. But the way he reacted, like it was personal, was so unsettling. I've been on bad dates before, but nothing that made me question my safety like that. I think what got to me the most was how normal he had seemed at first. It wasn't until it was too late that I realized I had been sitting across from a total stranger. Someone capable of something so off-kilter, it felt unreal. I blocked him that night, and I never heard from him again. But I still think about that night sometimes. Not just because of how bizarre it was, but because it was like I learned something about human nature that I wasn't prepared for. I guess some people just don't need much of a reason to go off the deep end. I went on this date with a guy named Reed once, and trust me, it's one of those stories I'll never forget. Not because it was fun or exciting, but because it was so weird, I'm still trying to figure out what the hell happened. Like, if I could erase one night from my memory, it would be this one. So, it started off pretty normal. We met through a mutual friend. Reed seemed like a cool guy, decent job, funny, into a lot of the same stuff I was. We were texting for a little while before we decided to grab dinner at this nice little bistro downtown. The place had a cozy vibe, low lights, the whole romantic but not too much thing. Honestly, I was excited because I'd been on some bad dates lately, and Reed seemed like he might be the one to break the streak. We sat down, ordered drinks, and everything seemed fine. He wasn't one of those awkward types who needed to fill every silence with forced conversation, and we were having a pretty easy chat about music, travel, and random stuff. But there was this weird thing that started to happen as the night went on. We were talking about some random topic, maybe movies or childhood memories, and suddenly, Reed looked at me and called me Mum. Just like that. Mum. At first, I thought I misheard him. Maybe he was joking or messing around. So, I gave him a second to backtrack, thinking it was just a slip-up. But no, he just kept going. Not even an awkward laugh or a whoops sorry moment. Just straight up Mum. I froze. I didn't know how to react. My brain kind of short-circuited for a second. Did he just call me his mom? I mean, we're on a date, right? A date, not some weird family reunion. I wanted to laugh it off, but it felt too weird. Instead, I just gave him a polite ha and hoped he'd catch himself. But nope, Reed didn't seem to notice. In fact, he actually doubled down on it. He said something like, you look a lot like my mom. You have the same smile, same eyes. Okay, that was when it hit me. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This wasn't some accidental word slip. He was seriously comparing me to his mother. Not only that, but he was saying I looked like her. In that moment, I didn't know if I should get up and walk out or stay and try to salvage the situation. I mean, who even does that? Who looks at someone you're on a date with and makes it clear you resemble their mom? I'm not going to lie, I felt weird. Really weird. Like suddenly I was sitting across from someone who saw me as a maternal figure or something. Not that I'm particularly old. Reed and I were close in age, maybe a few years apart at most. It was like he had this mental block where I was just somehow his mom now. But then things got even stranger. Reed kept talking about it, like he was digging himself into a deeper hole. He started saying stuff like, "You have the same kind of warmth about you that my mom does." And this wasn't said in some, oh, that sweet way. He was saying it with this intensity like he was comparing me to a woman he deeply admired his whole life. It felt more like a fixation than a compliment. I didn't know what to do. I mean, what do you even say when a guy keeps calling you his mom, but then says it like it's a good thing? It was as if he had this weird emotional attachment to me that I wasn't even aware of. The worst part was I couldn't even tell if he realized how creepy it was or if he just genuinely thought I'd find it flattering. At some point, I couldn't keep a straight face anymore. I had to say something, but I wasn't sure how to do it without making it even worse. So I tried the joke it off method. I said something like, "Well, I'm glad I have such a good maternal vibe, I guess." But Reed didn't pick up on my discomfort. He actually seemed proud of the comparison, like he thought it was some kind of surrogate mum or some shit. The more he talked, the more it felt like he was obsessed with the idea of me as a motherly figure. I started to wonder if I was on some kind of therapy session and didn't know it. Reed didn't mention anything remotely like this in his profile or texts, and suddenly I was regretting every second I'd spent with him. At this point, I just wanted the night to end. I couldn't even look at him anymore without picturing him sitting there with a weird mother fixation grin. I tried to steer the conversation into other topics, but Reed kept circling back to his mom obsession. He talked about how she was the most important woman in his life, and how he admired everything about her. He even started comparing my laugh to hers. I just I couldn't anymore. It felt like I was talking to someone who wasn't even aware of the line between admiration and something much darker. It was like a light bulb went off in my head, and suddenly I was scared. Scared because I realized Reed wasn't on this date to get to know me as a person. He was on it to, I don't know, replace his mom or something. I couldn't take it. So I excused myself. I didn't want to be rude, but I was genuinely uncomfortable. I could tell by the look on Reed's face that he wasn't quite processing why I was leaving. He seemed confused, like he didn't understand why I wasn't flattered by his motherly comparisons. He tried to talk me into staying, but I just couldn't sit there any longer. I left the restaurant quickly and texted him when I got home, telling him that I wasn't feeling it and that I didn't think we should see each other again. I didn't expect him to take it well, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from that situation as fast as possible. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe Reed didn't realize how his words were coming across. Maybe he thought it was a compliment. But in the end, it was one of the most bizarre experiences I've ever had on a date. I haven't heard from him since, and honestly, I don't ever want to again. Looking back, it feels almost surreal, like who calls someone mom on a first date, and who keeps saying it over and over again like it's totally normal. It's one of those things that makes you wonder if you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or if some people just have really weird issues they haven't worked out yet. Either way, I'm done with Reed and done with anyone who compares me to their mom on a first date. So I went on this date with a girl named Denise once, and it ended up being a total disaster. And by disaster, I mean it was so uncomfortable that I'm pretty sure I'll never forget it. It wasn't like some big dramatic fight or anything, but there was this moment, this one big awkward moment, that made me realize I had to get the hell out of there as soon as possible. Let me start from the beginning. Denise and I met on a dating app. Her profile was pretty chill. She seemed like one of those girls who didn't take herself too seriously, which I liked. We exchanged a few messages, had a good vibe, and after a couple of weeks, we decided to meet up for dinner. I'd picked this low-key Italian place, one of those where the lighting's just right and the food's good but not too fancy. It felt like the perfect spot for a first date. When I first saw Denise, she looked exactly like her pictures, which is always a good start. She had this kind of quiet energy to her, not overly bubbly, but still warm enough that it felt easy to talk to her. We grabbed a drink, sat down, and the first few minutes of the date were fine. Nothing strange. We chatted about work, family, random stuff. She seemed cool, but as the night went on, I could tell something was off. It happened around halfway through dinner. Denise had been talking about her childhood cat, Snowball. At first, it seemed like a normal conversation topic. She said she'd had him for years, since she was a kid, and how he was basically like a sibling to her. I nodded along, thinking it was sweet that's our family, I get. But then, without warning, her face shifted. Her eyes started to tear up, and her voice cracked as she talked about how Snowball had passed away a few months ago. I didn't think much of it at first. People get emotional about pets. Hell, I get emotional about pets. But then she started crying, and I don't mean just a couple of tears. I mean full-on ugly crying. Like her face turned red, her nose started running, and she couldn't even speak for a second. She was loudly crying, too. Not like the quiet sniffle you expect from someone trying to hold it together. This was full-on sobbing, and it wasn't stopping. I didn't know what to do. I'm not the greatest with emotions, and I'm especially bad when people cry in public. I don't know if that's just me, but I kind of freeze up when it happens. So I sat there, awkwardly poking at my food while she went through this meltdown. I tried to be nice, offering her some tissues and saying things like, "I'm sorry," and "it's okay." But honestly, it felt weird. We were on a first date, and now I was sitting there watching this girl cry in the middle of dinner, and I had no idea what to say or do. I mean, it's a cat, right? I get that pets are important, but I had no idea it would hit her this hard. But the more she cried, the more I started feeling like I was in over my head. Like I had no clue how to handle this kind of thing, especially on a first date. I kept glancing around the restaurant, half hoping someone would come over and rescue me from this awkward situation. But no one did. It was just me and her in this tiny booth while she sobbed uncontrollably about her dead cat. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 10 minutes, Denise finally started to calm down. She wiped her face, apologized, and tried to collect herself. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was fine and that I understood. But the whole situation had me feeling uncomfortable, like I was stuck in some weird emotional vortex I didn't belong in. But just when I thought the worst was over, Reed hit me with something else that totally threw me off. While we were sitting there, still in this awkward emotional limbo, she suddenly looked at me, wiped a tear away, and said something that I can't even wrap my head around. She said I reminded her of her ex-boyfriend. At first, I thought, okay, that's a bit random. But then she followed it up with something even weirder. You look like my mom, actually. I've never said that to anyone before, but you really remind me of her. Let me tell you, at that moment, I could feel every fiber of my being cringe. First, she was crying about her cat. Now it looked like her ex and her mom. This was not the kind of vibe I was going for. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure if she was being serious joking or if she was just that emotionally all over the place. But it felt off and I couldn't ignore it. She looked at me like she was really deep in thought, like she was analyzing my face as if she was comparing it to a photo album of her family. Her words hung in the air and I could feel the distance between us growing. It wasn't just the tears anymore. It was like I was sitting next to someone who had so many unresolved emotions that I couldn't even begin to understand. For the next few minutes, I tried to steer the conversation in another direction. I talked about random stuff, movies, work, hobbies, whatever, but Denise kept coming back to this idea that I looked like her mom. I swear, at this point, I was just nodding and trying to act like everything was fine, but it was becoming increasingly hard to ignore how weird the whole night had turned. I couldn't focus on the food anymore, and I couldn't focus on her either. Every time she mentioned her mom, I started thinking about the fact that I was on a date with a girl who was comparing me to her ex and her mother. What did that even mean? Was I her emotional backup plan, or was I just the guy who got stuck on this date by accident? By the time dessert came, I knew I had to get out of there. I couldn't deal with it anymore. I paid the check, tried to keep things polite, but I didn't really care about continuing the date. It felt too uncomfortable, like I was sitting there being someone's emotional rebound or substitute for something they had lost. I didn't hear from Denise again after that night, and honestly, I didn't want to. I felt bad for her, of course, but there was no way I could get past the fact that I was sitting across from someone who was that emotionally unstable. Crying over a cat is one thing, but talking about looking like her mom and her ex. Yeah, that's where I draw the line. So, that was my date with Denise. Not a happy ending. Not a fun one. Just one big, awkward mess I like to forget. If there's one thing I learned from that night, it's this. Sometimes a first date can get so weird so quickly that you just have to bail and never look back. So, I had this one date that started out normal but ended up being the absolute worst thing I've ever been through. And when I say worst, I mean I'm still trying to process it. Like, how does a guy go from nice to stalker in the span of a week? It all started when I matched with Paul on a dating app. He seemed fine at first. Good looking, had a decent job, seemed friendly enough in his messages. We exchanged a few texts and had a bit of back and forth before agreeing to meet at this cafe near my place. I figured it would be low key. No pressure. We could just talk, grab coffee, and see how things went. I was excited. It had been a while since I'd been on a date that didn't involve someone ghosting me halfway through texting, so I was cautiously optimistic. When I met Paul in person, he was exactly as he appeared in his pictures. Tall, dark hair, and those kind of intense eyes that looked like they were always thinking about something, like he was deeply analyzing the world. He was funny too. We talked about travel, movies, and dumb stuff like which Starbucks drinks were overrated. It was easy, fun, and honestly, I thought we were hitting it off. The conversation flowed well, and I didn't feel any red flags. He was a little intense in a way that felt more passionate than creepy, so I brushed it off as maybe just him being really into the topics we were discussing. We spent a couple of hours chatting, then said our goodbyes with a handshake. There was no kiss, no weirdness, just a nice, normal first date. At least that's what I thought. But then things started to get odd. The next day, Paul texted me. Fine, no big deal. I figured he'd be like any other guy after a date, just checking in, seeing I was interested in meeting again. But then it was a little too much. He started texting me about random things, like he was paying attention to stuff I hadn't even mentioned. He'd tell me how he liked the coffee I'd ordered or mentioned small details about the way I laughed or moved my hands when I spoke. At first, I thought it was sweet he was noticing things, right? But then it just kept coming. The texts were getting a little intense, like he was studying me. He'd message me multiple times a day, asking about things I didn't talk about on the date. Stuff like what I did during the weekend, who I was hanging out with, what my parents were like. And that's when I started to feel uncomfortable. I didn't know if he was being too into me or if he was just a little obsessive, but I was starting to get this weird vibe. Then, after about 3 days, things took a turn. I was out running errands when I saw Paul standing outside a store I was walking into. I was confused, like really confused. He waved at me and smiled like it was totally normal. I'd never told him I was going to that store, so the only way he could have known was if he had well followed me. I didn't want to overreact, so I just waved back awkwardly and kept walking. But after that, the weirdness escalated. The next time I went out with some friends to grab dinner, Paul was at the same restaurant. At first, I thought maybe it was a coincidence, but then I noticed he was sitting at a table by himself, watching me and my friends. It wasn't subtle. He was staring. I tried to brush it off and went back to my conversation, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. The worst part, he didn't even try to pretend he wasn't watching. There were moments when our eyes would meet and he'd just smile, that creepy, too wide grin. I'd get up to go to the bathroom, and the second I walked past him, I swear I felt his gaze follow me the whole way. After dinner, I texted him, asking if he was stalking me. I know I should have just blocked him right then and there, but I was trying to be polite. He responded by apologizing, claiming it was just a coincidence. He said he was in the area and didn't want to disturb me. I didn't respond and just let the conversation die. I didn't block him right away, though. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I was overthinking it. Maybe I was just being dramatic, right? But that kept happening. He started showing up at places I went to regularly. The gym, my favorite cafe, even the library. And every time, it was like he was just happening to be there. I didn't tell my friends about it at first because I didn't want them to think I was being paranoid. But after a week, I finally admitted it. They told me to block him, and honestly, I should have done that sooner. But I was still in that weird gray area of maybe he's not doing anything that weird. Maybe he's just really into me, I thought. But deep down, I knew this was crossing some kind of line. Things took an even darker turn when I came home one night and found a note on my door. Just a piece of paper with a few lines written in really neat handwriting. It said something like, "I know where you live. I'm thinking about visiting." And that was it. I won't lie, when I saw that note, my heart dropped into my stomach. I was freaking out. I don't even remember how I reacted. I think I froze for a few minutes, just staring at the note, trying to figure out what to do. I immediately called my best friend, told her what had happened, and she insisted I go to the police. I don't know why it took me so long to take things seriously. Maybe I thought I could handle it, or maybe I was just scared of the situation spiraling into something bigger. But the police took it seriously right away. I gave them all the info, including screenshots of his texts and photos of the places he'd been when I was there. They ended up putting him under investigation, and it didn't take long for them to track him down. Turns out, Paul had been following me for weeks. He knew exactly where I went, what time I went there, and how to show up without making it obvious he was there on purpose. It was a relief when they got involved, and soon after, I never heard from Paul again. He was warned, and I'm assuming he got the message loud and clear. I blocked him on every social platform, and I haven't seen him since. It's been months now, but I still feel weird about it. Every time I go out or visit a place I used to go, I half expect to see him lurking in the corner. I guess it's one of those things you don't really prepare for when you're dating online. People don't talk about this kind of stuff enough. Dating apps can be fun, but there's a side to them that can get really dark really fast. I learned a lot from that experience. Mostly, trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. And don't wait too long to cut someone out of your life if they're making you uncomfortable. You never know what will happen next. So I went on this date with a girl named Denise once, and it ended up being a total disaster. And by disaster, I mean it was so uncomfortable that I'm pretty sure I'll never forget it. It wasn't like some big dramatic fight or anything, but there was this moment, this one big awkward moment, that made me realize I had to get the hell out of there as soon as possible. Let me start from the beginning. Denise and I met on a dating app. Her profile was pretty chill. She seemed like one of those girls who didn't take herself too seriously, which I liked. We exchanged a few messages, had a good vibe, and after a couple of weeks, we decided to meet up for dinner. I picked this low-key Italian place, one of those where the lighting's just right and the food's good but not too fancy. It felt like the perfect spot for a first date. When I first saw Denise, she looked exactly like her pictures, which is always a good start. She had this kind of quiet energy to her, not overly bubbly, but still warm enough that it felt easy to talk to her. We grabbed a drink, sat down, and the first few minutes of the date were fine. Nothing strange. We chatted about work, family, random stuff. She seemed cool, but as the night went on, I could tell something was off. It happened around halfway through dinner. Denise had been talking about her childhood cat, Snowball. At first, it seemed like a normal conversation topic. She said she'd had him for years since she was a kid, and how he was basically like a sibling to her. I nodded along, thinking it was sweet, pets are family, I get it. But then, without warning, her face shifted. Her eyes started to tear up, and her voice cracked as she talked about how Snowball had passed away a few months ago. I didn't think much of it at first. People get emotional about pets. Hell, I get emotional about pets. But then she started crying. And I don't mean just a couple of tears. I mean full-on ugly crying. Like her face turned red, her nose started running, and she couldn't even speak for a second. She was loudly crying, too. Not like the quiet sniffle you expect from someone trying to hold it together. This was full-on sobbing, and it wasn't stopping. I didn't know what to do. I'm not the greatest with emotions, and I'm especially bad when people cry in public. I don't know if that's just me, but I kind of freeze up when it happens. So I sat there, awkwardly poking at my food while she went through this meltdown. I tried to be nice, offering her some tissues and saying things like, "I'm sorry," and "it's okay." But honestly, it felt weird. We were on a first date, and I was sitting there watching this girl cry in the middle of dinner, and I had no idea what to say or do. I mean, it's a cat, right? I get that pets are important, but I had no idea it would hit her this hard. But the more she cried, the more I started feeling like I was in over my head. Like I had no clue how to handle this kind of thing, especially on a first date. I kept glancing around the restaurant, half hoping someone would come over and rescue me from this awkward situation. But no one did. It was just me and her in this tiny booth while she sobbed uncontrollably about her dead cat. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 10 minutes, Denise finally started to calm down. She wiped her face, apologized, and tried to collect herself. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was fine and that I understood. But the whole situation had me feeling uncomfortable, like I was stuck in some weird emotional vortex I didn't belong in. But just when I thought the worst was over, Reed hit me with something else that totally threw me off. While we were sitting there, still in this awkward emotional limbo, she suddenly looked at me, wiped a tear away, and said something that I can't even wrap my head around. She said it reminded her of her ex-boyfriend. At first I thought, okay, that's a bit random, but then she followed it up with something even weirder. "You look like my mom, actually. I've never said that to anyone before, but you really remind me of her." Let me tell you, at that moment, I could feel every fiber of my being cringe. First, she's crying about her cat. Now I look like her ex and her mom. This is not the kind of vibe I was going for. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure if she was being serious, joking, or if she was just that emotionally all over the place. But it felt off, and I couldn't ignore it. She looked at me like she was really deep in thought, like she was analyzing my face as if she was comparing it to a photo album of her family. Her words hung in the air, and I could feel the distance between us growing. It wasn't just the tears anymore. It was like I was sitting next to someone who had so many unresolved emotions that I couldn't even begin to understand. For the next few minutes, I tried to steer the conversation in another direction. I talked about random stuff, movies, work, hobbies, whatever. But Denise kept coming back to this idea that I looked like her mom. I swear, at this point, I was just nodding and trying to act like everything was fine. But it was becoming increasingly hard to ignore how weird the whole night had turned. I couldn't focus on the food anymore, and I couldn't focus on her either. Every time she mentioned her mom, I started thinking about the fact that I was on a date with a girl who was comparing me to her ex and her mother. What did that even mean? Was I her emotional backup plan, or was I just a guy who got stuck on this date by accident? By the time dessert came, I knew I had to get out of there. I couldn't deal with it anymore. I paid the check, tried to keep things polite, but I didn't really care about continuing the date. It felt too uncomfortable, like I was sitting there being someone's emotional rebound or substitute for something they had lost. I didn't hear from Denise again after that night, and honestly, I didn't want to. I felt bad for her, of course, but there was no way I could get past the fact that I was sitting across from someone who was that emotionally unstable. Crying over a cat is one thing, but talking about looking like her mom and her ex, yeah, that's where I draw a line. So that was my date with Denise. Not a happy ending. Not a fun one. Just one big, awkward mess I like to forget. If there's one thing I learned from that night, it's this. Sometimes a first date can get so weird so quickly that you just have to bail and never look back. There's just one date I went on that I still think about, and honestly, I don't even know how to process it. It started off like a normal date, on a dating app, chatting, setting up plans, but it ended in a way I never expected. What should have been a regular coffee date turned into the most uncomfortable, bizarre, and honestly disturbing encounter I've ever had. I matched with Tina on a dating app. Her profile seemed pretty standard, cute photos, a bit quirky, some good interests listed. She was talking about how much she loved hiking and reading, and she had a dog, which I thought was a good sign. The vibe seemed relaxed, so I thought, why not? We'd been chatting for a little while, and I figured it'd be nice to meet up. So we set up a time to grab coffee at this local cafe I liked. Nothing fancy, just a chill place with a good atmosphere. When I walked in, I saw Tina right away. She was sitting at a small table by the window, scrolling through her phone. I walked over to say hi, and that's when I noticed something strange. The smell. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it hit me almost immediately. It was like musty, stale, like wet clothes that had been left in a bag for too long mixed with something metallic. It was strong, and it was not a subtle thing. At first, I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was the cafe itself, or maybe I was just imagining things. I sat down, said hello, and we started talking. But the smell? It was still there, and it wasn't going away. As the conversation went on, it started getting harder to ignore. I kept glancing around, hoping maybe there was a smell somewhere else in the cafe, but no. It was definitely her. I don't know why I didn't bring it up at first. I mean, I didn't want to be rude, and I thought maybe I was being too sensitive. But as we talked, the smell seemed to get worse. It wasn't just the smell either. I started noticing other things too, like her clothes weren't exactly dirty, but they looked worn, like they hadn't been washed in a while. Her hair was a little greasy, and her skin looked like it hadn't seen the sun in ages. Despite all that, I tried to focus on the conversation. She was talking about her dog and how she was really into reading this new book she had just started. But even as I tried to follow along, I couldn't help but feel more uncomfortable with every passing minute. I kept thinking, should I just leave? Am I being a jerk for even thinking this? Then, out of nowhere, Tina mentioned how she'd been living out of her car for the past few months. She said it like it was no big deal, just casually slipped it into the conversation as if everyone should be cool with it. At first, I didn't really know how to respond to that. I mean, I hadn't been expecting it. I started putting the pieces together. The smell, the worn clothes, her mention of being on the move a lot. I felt like I was slowly realizing something about her that I hadn't anticipated, but didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe she was just going through a tough time, right? People have rough patches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Tina kept talking about how she loved the freedom of being on the road. She said she didn't mind being homeless. It's not so bad, she said, like she was trying to convince both of us. I've got everything I need. I've got my dog, my car, and I can go anywhere I want. She smiled, and I could tell she was trying to make it sound like she was totally fine with it. But I wasn't buying it. The way she talked about it felt defensive, like she was trying to justify it to herself as much as to me. Honestly, at that point, I was kind of in shock. I had no idea how to process this. I wasn't sure if I should just leave or if I should keep talking and pretend like everything was normal. I felt bad for her. She was obviously going through some stuff, but this was way outside of what I had expected from a first date. At the same time, I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to keep the conversation going. She told me more about how she'd been moving around a lot, bouncing between different parking lots, staying with friends when she could, but mostly sleeping in her car. She said she didn't like to talk about it much, but today she felt like she could open up. As she spoke, I started to feel like I was trapped in a conversation I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't trying to sound judgmental, but my mind kept spinning. How had I not seen the signs earlier? I started to get more and more uncomfortable. My stomach was in knots, and I couldn't stop thinking about the smell that was still lingering in the air. At this point, I knew I had to go. I didn't want to make a scene, but I couldn't sit there any longer listening to her talk about how being homeless was actually fine and freeing. I started making excuses about how I needed to get going, and she seemed to understand. She didn't seem offended or upset, just resigned, like this was normal for her. But the whole thing felt off, and I just wanted out. I paid for the coffee, gave a quick, awkward goodbye, and left. I don't think I ever walked away from a date faster in my life. I didn't hear from Tina again after that. Honestly, I don't know if I even want to. I feel for her situation, I really do, but the whole date was just so weird. I had no idea how to respond to the fact that she was living out of her car, and frankly, I felt overwhelmed by the whole thing. I wasn't ready to be someone's savior on a first date. I wasn't prepared for that kind of emotional baggage. It took me a while to even tell anyone about it because I didn't want to sound like I was judging her. I guess I still feel a little guilty for just bailing out. But at the end of the day, I realized that I wasn't equipped to handle that kind of situation on a first date. I wanted someone who was in a similar place emotionally, and I didn't know how to deal with the fact that Tina was so clearly struggling. I guess the whole thing just made me realize how quickly things can go sideways when you're dating someone. Sometimes you think you know what you're getting into, but life throws a curveball and you're left trying to figure out how to handle it. Looking back, I just hope Tina finds some stability and maybe one day she'll find the help she needs. But that was one day I won't ever forget. All right, this one is honestly weird, and I've never really talked about it because I still don't know how to process it. So I went on this date with a guy named Ron, and at first I thought it was going to be like any other date, kind of casual, maybe a little awkward, but nothing out of the ordinary. You know, like those dates where you're both just kind of figuring each other out. But this one was something I'll never forget. It all started when I matched with Ron on a dating app. He was cute, had a solid profile, and seemed to be into the same kind of stuff as me: movies, hiking, trying out new food spots. The usual, we chatted for a few days, and he seemed pretty normal. He wasn't super intense or anything, just your average guy trying to make small talk. After a bit, we decided to meet up for dinner at this trendy pizza place downtown. When I showed up, I was expecting the usual first date nerves, some awkwardness, maybe stumbling over words, figuring out what to order. But when I walked in and saw Ron sitting at a table, my first thought was, okay, this guy looks really familiar. It was a weird feeling like I'd seen him somewhere before, but I shook it off and sat down across from him. I said, hey, and smiled, and he kind of nodded back but didn't say anything. I assumed maybe he was just shy. Some people are, right? I've met plenty of people who are quiet at first and warm up after a little while. So I started talking. Small talk, you know. How's your day been? And what's good here? Just the usual stuff to get things going. But instead of responding, Ron just stared at me. He was looking at me, but he didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even smile. It was like he was just there, but not really there at all. At first, I thought maybe he didn't hear me. Maybe I wasn't speaking loud enough or something. So I tried again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. He just kept staring. The silence was killing me, and I started to feel like I was on some weird hidden camera show where they were testing how long it would take for me to lose my mind. But I still didn't say anything. Maybe he was just nervous, right? I tried again, this time with a joke to break the tension. Something about how this pizza place was known for its giant slices, and how I was thinking I might need a second stomach. I laughed at my own dumb joke with Ron. He just stared. There was no reaction. I'm pretty sure I looked around the restaurant to see if anyone else noticed how bizarre the situation was, but no. Everyone else seemed to be going about their business. By now, I was starting to feel really uncomfortable. I had no idea what was going on. Was he messing with me? Was he so socially awkward that he couldn't even say a word? My mind started running through all these scenarios. Maybe he was having a panic attack. Maybe he was on some weird medication. But none of that explained why he wasn't even attempting to engage at all. So I decided to just power through it. I ordered my food, tried to eat, but I couldn't stop thinking about how awkward the whole thing was. The silence felt like it was pressing in on me. Every time I looked up, Ron was still staring. No expression, no sign of recognition that we were even sharing the same space. I honestly didn't know if I should stay or just leave, but I didn't want to be rude, so I stayed. I kept telling myself it was just a weird moment that would pass. And then, just as I was finishing my pizza, Ron finally said something. But it wasn't what I expected. He looked up at me and said, in this weirdly monotone voice, that he had a condition. I don't even remember the name of it, but apparently it made it so he couldn't speak unless he absolutely had to. Something to do with being completely overwhelmed by verbal communication or whatever. I can't even explain it exactly, but I remember him saying something about how talking made him feel physically sick. He said he was fine with writing things down, but verbal conversation was just too much for him. Now, don't get me wrong. People have all kinds of things going on, and I get it. Maybe I should have been more understanding, but at the time, all I could think was, why didn't you say this earlier? It was such a weird vibe for a first date, and I felt totally blindsided. I didn't know how to react. I think I just nodded and said something like, okay, that's fine. But the whole dinner was already ruined. I felt like I had spent the entire time talking to a brick wall, trying to pull conversation out of someone who wasn't even trying. It didn't help that I had no idea if he was actually interested in me or if he was just there because he felt like he had to be. Ron didn't seem upset or apologetic. He didn't seem anything. He was just there, kind of like a mannequin sitting across from me. He didn't try to explain himself more or make any effort to ease the awkwardness. It was like the whole thing was just normal for him. But for me, I was over it. I finished my food, excused myself to the bathroom, and when I came back, I just said I had to go. There wasn't really anything else to say. I paid the check. As I was leaving, Ron didn't even try to say goodbye. He just gave me this half nod like he couldn't even muster the energy to look me in the eyes. I don't even know why he agreed to go on a date if he wasn't planning on talking at all. It wasn't like he had some emergency or anything. He just sat there for the entire meal, not even making an effort. I've thought about that date so many times since then. At first, I felt guilty for feeling frustrated, but honestly, it was just the weirdest experience. He could warn me beforehand that he had this condition, and I would have been more than happy to adjust. But to sit there in complete silence with someone who was physically present, but not really present. It felt like I was talking to someone who wasn't even there. It wasn't just awkward, it was creepy. Anyway, I haven't seen Ron since that date. I'm sure he's probably a nice guy or whatever, but that whole thing just wasn't for me. I can deal with some weird situations, but being stuck in silence with someone who can't communicate at all, that's next level uncomfortable. I guess it's just one of those dates you try to forget, but somehow never really can. I'll never forget the first date I had with Callum. It was one of those things where everything seemed fine at first, but then it just spiraled into something I could never have expected. Honestly, I still have no idea what went wrong or what even happened that night, but I know one thing. It was by far the weirdest and most unsettling date I've ever been on. It all started when I matched with Callum on a dating app. His profile seemed decent enough. He looked chill, said he was into hiking, dogs, and good conversation. He didn't come off as too pushy, which is always a plus. We exchanged a few texts, mostly about what we like to do on weekends, where we were from, stuff like that. Nothing out of the ordinary, really. After chatting for a week or so, we decided to meet up for dinner at this little Italian place in the city. It was cozy, not too fancy, but not a dive either. I thought it would be perfect for a first date. When I showed up, Callum was already there, sitting at a table near the window. He looked pretty normal, maybe a little more dressed up than I expected, but I wasn't mad about it. He stood up to greet me, smiled, and we shook hands. All good so far. But then things got weird. I'm not sure exactly when it started, but as soon as we sat down and I started talking, Callum just started laughing. Like, not just a chuckle or a nervous laugh, but full-on uncontrollable, almost manic laughter. He wasn't even reacting to anything funny I said. He was just laughing for no reason. At first, I thought it was a weird joke or some kind of strange nervous tic. Maybe he was just awkward, right? I mean, we've all been there. But as the laughter kept going, it started feeling less like nervousness and more like something was off. People around us were looking. I could tell because I was starting to feel super uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it and just keep talking, but it wasn't easy when every few seconds he'd burst into these fits of laughter for no apparent reason. At this point, I wasn't even sure what to do. It wasn't like he was trying to be funny. There was no punchline, no change in conversation that would make sense for him to laugh like that. It was like he couldn't control it. My mind started racing. Was he on something? Was he just really bad at social situations? But the way his eyes looked, wide and kind of unfocused, made me think it wasn't just nerves. I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction, but he talked about something more neutral. I mentioned a movie I'd recently watched, thinking it might be a good distraction, but nope. Instead, he started laughing harder. It wasn't like a ha, that's funny laugh either. It was erratic, loud, and honestly kind of disturbing. I remember feeling my face go hot as I started to wonder if I should just leave. I couldn't even focus on the conversation anymore because I was so fixated on his weird behavior. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of this laughter, Callum paused, looked me straight in the eyes, and said something that completely threw me off. He told me that he was on drugs. No build-up, no warning, Just a random statement that came out of nowhere. I had no idea how to react. I was stunned. I mean, who says that on a date, right? It was like everything clicked into place, but instead of feeling relieved, I just felt more anxious. My heart started racing. I wasn't sure what kind of drugs he meant, but it definitely wasn't something I wanted to be around. And then he kept going. He said he was a drug dealer. He didn't go into too much detail, but he kind of dropped it like it was no big deal. As if telling a random person you're selling drugs isn't a huge red flag. I wasn't sure if he was being serious or just out of it, but the more he talked, the more it seemed like he was absolutely not joking. I started thinking about how quickly I could get out of there. The laughter hadn't stopped, and now it was like he was high as a kite, talking about his business with this strange casualness. It felt like everything I'd learned about him in the past few days had been some weird facade. Like I've been talking to a completely different person the whole time. At this point, I was ready to bolt. The whole situation felt so off. I remember telling myself, just get through dinner, stay calm, and leave. But he wouldn't stop talking. He kept telling me stories about his clients and how he knew people and how easy it was to make money. It was like he was in some kind of trance, and I couldn't make sense of any of it. My mind was racing. Should I tell someone? Should I report him? What if he followed me home? What if he got violent? I don't know why, but it felt like he was testing me to see how far he could go. And then, out of nowhere, he just stopped. He stopped laughing, stopped talking, and sat back in his chair, staring at me with this strange look on his face, like he was waiting for me to say something, but I had no idea what to say. I tried to smile to keep things calm, but I couldn't keep the panic out of my chest. I was honestly scared. I didn't know if he was going to get more aggressive, or if he was just out of it and had no idea what he was saying. The whole thing felt surreal. I didn't want to make a scene, but I knew I had to leave. I excused myself, told him I wasn't feeling well, and got up from the table. I don't think he even noticed at first. He just stared at me, still with that weird look on his face, like he was trying to figure me out. I left the restaurant as fast as I could, heart pounding the whole time. When I got outside, I took a breath and tried to calm myself down. But I could still hear that laugh in my head, echoing over and over. I never talked to him again after that. I blocked him on the dating app, deleted his number, and did everything I could to forget about it. But I'll never forget that feeling, being trapped in a situation where you have no idea what's happening or how to get out of it. The way he laughed, the way he casually told me about his life as a drug dealer, it's like my brain still can't fully process it. Looking back, I don't know if he was just on something or if he was always like that. Maybe he was testing the waters, trying to see if I'd be okay with it. Maybe it was just all in my head, but honestly, I don't think I'll ever be able to trust my instincts about people the same way again. It's been a while since that date, but every once in a while, I still think about it. I never expected my first date with Anna to turn out the way it did. I mean, I've had my share of awkward dates, but this one was something else. It was like walking into a totally different world. Well, I had no clue existed, and honestly, it was pretty unsettling. I've been thinking about it a lot recently and figured I'd share what happened, even though it still messes with me every now and then. So I matched with Anna on a dating app. She was around my age, early 20s, I think, or at least that's what I assumed. Her photos were cute, and she had a good vibe in her profile. She didn't have anything weird in her bio, just the usual stuff. She said she loved traveling and liked the occasional luxury hotel stay. Seemed harmless enough. After a few chats back and forth, we decided to meet up for dinner. She suggested a place that was fancy, way fancier than anything I would have picked, but I was cool with it. I mean, who doesn't like a nice meal, right? The place was upscale, white tablecloths, low lighting, a bit romantic, but not too much. Nothing too crazy, but definitely not the usual bar I go to. When I walked in, I immediately realized something was off. Anna wasn't at the table I'd been told to meet her at, so I scanned the room, and holy shit. There she was, sitting at the bar, looking nothing like I expected. I walked up to her, and she stood up to greet me, smiling like we were old friends. She was older, like way older. She looked to be in her 60s, maybe even 70s. She wasn't attractive, but I definitely wasn't expecting her to be that old. Her face had a lot of character, wrinkles, but not in a bad way. She looked like she'd lived a full life. I mean, I wasn't freaked out or anything, but I was confused. I wasn't expecting this. She seemed totally unbothered by the age gap and acted like it was totally normal. She had this sophisticated vibe going on, and when we started talking, I noticed right away that she wasn't like anyone I had met before. She was super well spoken and seemed to have an answer for everything, like she'd seen and done it all. She talked about her travels, her life in different countries, her art collection, and some of the rich people she knew. But as the night went on, I started getting a little uncomfortable. She ordered wine, expensive wine, and when the waiter brought it, she made a huge deal about how it was the best vintage from Bordeaux, and how it was only available in certain countries. I didn't know much about wine, but I could tell it was a flex. She ordered the most expensive dish on the menu and didn't bat an eye. Me. I was just trying to go along with it, but I could feel myself starting to zone out. I wasn't used to being around someone who seemed so comfortable in their wealth. As the night went on, I started asking more questions, just trying to make conversation. And the more I learned about Anna, the more out of place I felt. She didn't just live in some fancy condo or work a high-paying job. She was rich, like had been rich for decades. She owned multiple properties around the world. She worked with famous artists, and apparently she was into philanthropy, though I couldn't tell if she was just bragging or actually sincere. Either way, it was clear she had money to burn. Then things took another turn. She casually mentioned that she'd been married a few times and had lots of suitors over the years. But instead of it being something sad or regretful, she said it in this way that made it sound like she was proud of it, like being married multiple times was some kind of achievement. She didn't seem lonely or desperate, though. She seemed content, maybe even a little too content, like she wasn't even looking for anything serious. It felt like she was just checking me out, seeing if I'd fit in her world. And that's when it hit me. This was a power move. She was playing a game I didn't understand, and it made me feel small. The age difference wasn't just physical, it was mental too. She wasn't just experienced in life, she had control. I could feel it in the way she carried herself. She didn't even seem like a woman who wanted a casual hookup. She was more interested in molding people into her world in a way that made me feel like I was just a pawn in whatever game she was playing. As we got further into the meal, the conversation shifted to more personal topics. She asked me about my family, my background, and where I saw myself in a few years. She kept talking about how important it was to be successful and how money, while not everything, made life so much easier. At first, I thought she was just being blunt, but the more she talked, the more it felt like she was teaching me. Like everything she said was a lesson for my future, even though I hadn't asked for one. It was a little creepy how much she wanted to shape my perspective, and I started to feel trapped in this conversation. After dinner, we went for a walk in the park. By this point, I was already mentally exhausted. It felt like I was being talked at more than talked to. As we walked, she brought up the subject of children, and that's when I realized how different we were. She told me she didn't have any, but had always thought about adopting. It was like she was trying to get me to see her as some kind of mother figure, which was just strange, especially given our age difference. Then she shocked me again. She asked if I wanted to come back to her place for a dessert. At this point, I wasn't sure what she meant. But when we arrived at her penthouse, yeah, it was that kind of place, the kind you only see in movies. I was hit with the full extent of her wealth. Everything was sleek, modern, and impossibly expensive. I didn't know what to do with myself. I spent maybe 15 minutes in her penthouse, but by that point, I had had enough. It was like everything I saw, everything she said, was just pushing me further and further out of my comfort zone. I was getting the vibe that she wasn't interested in a relationship. She was interested in controlling the situation and showing me how out of my league I was. So I made an excuse and left. I wasn't rude. I wasn't sticking around for whatever game she was trying to play. Afterward, I tried to process it all, what had just happened. The whole night felt like I was part of some weird power play, and I couldn't tell if I actually enjoyed the date or if I'd been manipulated into thinking I had. The fact that she was 60, the fact that she had this ridiculous amount of wealth, it just didn't sit right with me. It was too much. Too overwhelming. I haven't heard from Anna since. I blocked her number, deleted the dating app, and tried to forget the whole thing. Honestly, I think I dodged a bullet. Looking back, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd let it go further. But part of me is thankful that I didn't. I'm not sure what kind of world she was trying to pull me into, but it wasn't the one I was ready for. This is one of those stories that still messes with me. I've never really told anyone about it because it feels like I've been carrying around this weird, messed up secret for a while. What should have been a casual one-night date turned into a situation that I never expected. I still don't know if it was just a crazy coincidence, or if I somehow ended up in the middle of someone else's chaotic reality. Either way, it was unsettling in ways I can't even explain. So, it all started like most casual hookups do. I met Kelly on a dating app. We'd been chatting for a few days and she seemed pretty cool. She had a nice vibe, down to earth, funny, and pretty easy to talk to. There were no signs that anything was off at first. She didn't come on too strong, and she didn't seem like the type who was looking for anything serious. Honestly, we both seemed like we were just looking for a good time. Nothing more, nothing less. We decided to meet up for drinks at this bar downtown. It wasn't anything fancy, just a dive bar with a chill atmosphere. Nothing over the top, but definitely enough to break the ice. We got along fine, had a few drinks, and the conversation flowed easily. The night was moving in a typical direction, light flirting, talking about life, laughing at each other's stories. It wasn't the best date I'd ever been on, but it was far from bad. I thought things were going pretty well. As the night went on, we both had a few more drinks, and at the end of it, the chemistry was obvious. We were both a little tipsy, but we were both into each other, so we decided to head back to my place. Nothing unusual, right? A couple of drinks, some good vibes, and a decision to keep the night going. When we got back to my apartment, things just kind of escalated. We started kissing, and before I knew it, we were both in the middle of a hookup. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, just a couple of people having a good time. At least that's what I thought. In the moment, everything felt fine, like a typical night where you meet someone new and enjoy each other's company. We didn't talk much, but I didn't think that was weird. Sometimes things just happen, right? The next morning, I woke up to find her still in my bed, which wasn't strange. It was a one-night thing, and I had no problem with that. But something was off. Kelly was quiet. She didn't seem like herself, and the energy in the room felt tense. She was just laying there, looking at the ceiling, almost like she was deep in thought. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring she was probably just feeling a little awkward or hungover. We didn't know each other that well, and mornings after a casual hookup can be a little weird. So I tried to lighten the mood with some small talk. "Good morning," I said, trying to act normal. But then she turned to me. Her face wasn't angry or upset, but there was this strange look in her eyes, like she had something important to say, but she wasn't sure how to say it. She told me she had something on her mind, and that's when she dropped the bombshell. She told me that she was pregnant. Yeah, you read that right. She told me she was pregnant with my kid. At first, I thought she was joking. I laughed a little, expecting her to crack a smile and say something like, "I'm just messing with you." But no, she didn't smile. She didn't laugh. She just looked at me, dead serious. She said that she was sure of it. The timing matched up with when we'd hooked up, and she seemed completely convinced that I was the father. I can't even explain how it felt to hear that. It was like the whole room went quiet. My head started spinning. I didn't know how to react. I wasn't panicking, but I was definitely in shock. I didn't know Kelly that well. Hell, I just met her the night before. This wasn't something I was prepared to handle. She went on to explain that she had some medical issues in the past, and she couldn't have kids unless it was the right time. And according to her, it was definitely the right time. She said she'd had some issues with birth control in the past, and that she hadn't been on it for a while. She was pretty calm about it, but I could see the worry behind her eyes. I don't think she was making it up, but I also don't know if I believed her completely. I spent the next few minutes trying to wrap my mind around it. Was this some sort of game? I thought. Maybe she was just trying to trap me into something. But why would she wait until after we hooked up to drop a bomb like this? Something about the whole situation didn't add up, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Kelly was serious about what she said, though. She told me that she wanted to keep the baby and that she didn't think I should run away from my responsibilities. And it wasn't like she was asking for anything right away. She wasn't demanding money or anything crazy. She said she just wanted me to know, as she left it at that. But that didn't make it feel any less bizarre. I'm not the kind of guy who jumps into things, especially not something as huge as parenthood, and I definitely wasn't ready for that. So I told her I needed time to think about it. She understood, and honestly, she didn't push the issue any further. She just got dressed, said goodbye, and left. After she left, I felt completely overwhelmed. I didn't know what to think. I'd been careful, or at least I thought I had been. Was this really happening? Could I have actually gotten her pregnant on the first date? What were the odds? A few days went by and I tried to contact her a couple of times. I wanted to know if she was serious, but I never heard back. It was like she just vanished. I left a few texts and messages, but nothing. I started to wonder if maybe she had made the whole thing up, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than I realized. To this day, I don't know what happened with Kelly. Did she really think she was pregnant, or was she playing some kind of game? I have no idea. But the whole experience left me freaked out, questioning everything. It's been months now, and I still think about it sometimes. What if she was telling the truth? What if she wasn't? Either way, I'll never forget that first date, and I'll probably never understand what the hell happened.